Look at your arm right now. Go ahead, really look at it. You probably see some fine hair, maybe barely visible unless you're in the right light. The kind of hair that does essentially nothing, doesn't keep you warm, doesn't protect your skin, doesn't serve any obvious purpose at all. Now imagine that same arm covered in thick, coarse fur, dark, dense hair like you'd see on a chimpanzee or gorilla, hair thick enough to shed water, to provide insulation on cold nights, to protect your skin from thorns and biting insects. Hair that actually does something. That's what your ancestors looked like, not your great-great-grandparents. We're talking way back, millions of years into the past, before tools, before fire, before language, before anything we'd recognize as human culture. Your ancestors were covered head to toe in protective fur, just like every other primate species that has ever existed. And then something changed. Somehow, over the course of hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of years, that fur disappeared. We became naked, bizarrely uniquely naked among all primates, and nobody is entirely sure why. This is one of the strangest mysteries in human evolution. Because here's the thing, fur is useful, incredibly useful. It's nature's multi-purpose solution to dozens of survival problems. It insulates against cold, it shields skin from the sun, it provides a barrier against biting insects and parasites. It helps regulate body temperature. It even serves important social functions. Every other primate species on Earth has kept their fur. Chimpanzees have it, gorillas have it, orangutans, bonobos, every species of monkey, they're all covered in protective hair. But humans? We're the weird ones. We're the naked apes walking around with bare skin exposed to the elements. Out of over 5,000 mammal species on Earth, only a handful are effectively hairless. Elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, whales, dolphins, a few species of pigs, and the delightfully named naked mole rat. That's roughly the company we keep. And notice what most of those animals have in common. They're either absolutely massive and living in hot climates, or they're aquatic. They have very specific reasons for losing their fur that don't obviously apply to a medium-sized land-dwelling primate. So what happened to us? Why would evolution strip away a feature that had worked perfectly well for millions of years? What environmental pressure could have been strong enough to overcome all the obvious advantages that fur provides? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, you're in exactly the right place. That's precisely why I make these videos, so maybe hit that subscribe button and tell me where you are and what time it is right now in the comments. I love seeing them, Tokyo at 3 in the morning, Chicago at midnight, someone in Alaska watching the northern lights. All of us scattered across the world, wondering about the same ancient mystery. The question of human hairlessness has obsessed scientists for over a century. Charles Darwin himself was puzzled by it. He could explain why giraffes evolved long necks and why birds developed different beak shapes, but human nakedness, that one stumped him. He eventually settled on an idea involving sexual selection. Basically that our ancestors found hairless partners more attractive, so hairlessness spread through the population as a preferred trait. But even Darwin wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. He knew there had to be more to the story. Since then, researchers have proposed at least a dozen different theories. Some think we lost our fur because we started running long distances in the hot African sun and needed better cooling mechanisms. Others believe it happened when our ancestors spent significant time in and around water, the so-called Aquatic Ape Theory that remains controversial to this day. Some scientists argue it was about parasites, that getting rid of fur meant getting rid of disease-carrying ticks and lice. And there are theories involving social signaling, brain development, even the mastery of fire and clothing. Here's what makes this mystery particularly fascinating. They might all be partially right. Evolution doesn't usually happen for just one reason. It's messier than that. Multiple pressures working together, each one nudging our ancestors in the same direction over millions of years. Each theoretical explanation might explain part of the puzzle, but no single theory seems to explain everything. What we do know is that something dramatic happened. Something that made our ancestors fundamentally different from every other primate that ever existed. And that difference rippled through every aspect of human evolution. Think about what that means for a moment. Our hairless skin isn't just a minor detail, some trivial quirk of human appearance. It's actually one of the defining features that makes us human. Consider all the things that changed because we lost our fur. First, it forced us to invent clothing. Without natural insulation, we needed artificial covering, and the invention of clothing led to culture and identity, the ability to signal who you are through what you wear. Second, it fundamentally changed how we regulate body temperature. We became the sweatiest primates on Earth, developing millions of specialized sweat glands that only work efficiently on bare skin. This adaptation let us run farther than almost any other animal, enabling hunting strategies no other predator could match. Third, it exposed our skin to the sun, forcing the evolution of dark pigmentation to protect against ultraviolet damage. Different populations later evolved lighter or darker skin depending on where they lived, creating the diversity we see today. Fourth, it made us vulnerable to cold, which pushed us to master fire, one of the most important technological breakthroughs in human history. And here's something most people never consider. Losing our fur changed how we communicate. You can see someone blush. You can watch them go pale with fear or flushed with embarrassment. Try doing that through a thick layer of fur. Our bare faces enabled an unprecedented level of emotional transparency and nonverbal communication. We can read micro-expressions, detect subtle shifts in mood, assess health status at a glance. This capability would have been impossible with fur-covered faces. The loss of our fur is connected to nearly every major development that distinguishes humans from other apes. Our large brains, our sophisticated social structures, our technological capabilities, our global spread across every continent, all of it traces back, at least in part, to the moment our ancestors started going naked. But when did this happen? When exactly did the transformation from furry ape to naked human occur? And more importantly, why? What was happening in our ancestors' lives that made hairlessness more advantageous than keeping their protective coat? These questions don't have simple answers. Hair doesn't fossilize, so we can't just dig up ancient skeletons and check whether they were furry or naked. But we can make educated guesses based on indirect evidence, genetic studies, comparisons with other species, analysis of where and how our ancestors lived. And those guesses paint a picture of a profound transformation that began somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago. The earliest hominids, species like Sahelanthropus and Ardipithecus, who lived 6 to 7 million years ago, were almost certainly fully furred. They lived in forests, moved through trees, faced the same environmental challenges as other apes. There was no reason to lose the hair. Even the Australopithecus species, who lived from about 4 to 2 million years ago, and spent more time walking upright on the ground, probably retained most of their body hair. They were still relatively small-bodied, still living in mixed woodland and savanna environments, where fur would have been advantageous. The shift probably began with the emergence of the genus Homo, our genus. Early Homo species like Homo habilis and especially Homo erectus showed significant changes in body proportions. They were taller, more linear, with longer legs relative to their torsos. This is a body plan optimized for efficient walking and, crucially, for heat dissipation in open environments. And here's where things get interesting. When you commit to a tall, upright body plan adapted for hot, open spaces, fur starts becoming more of a liability than an asset. The genetic evidence supports this timeline. Studies of the genes responsible for skin pigmentation suggest that dark skin, which only becomes necessary after you lose the protective hair, evolved somewhere between 1.2 and 1.8 million years ago. This tells us that by that time, our ancestors had already lost enough fur that their skin needed protection from direct sunlight. By the time Homo heidelbergensis appeared around 700,000 years ago, our ancestors were probably mostly hairless. Not completely, they almost certainly kept head hair to protect the brain, eyebrows to channel sweat, eyelashes to keep out dust, and patches of hair in areas associated with scent glands. But the dense primate standard body hair? Gone. Our ancestors had become, by primate standards, bizarrely naked. This transformation would change everything, because losing fur didn't just change how we looked, it changed how we hunted, how we regulated body temperature, how we dealt with parasites, how we communicated socially, how we thought about clothing and shelter. Those remnants we still carry. The hair on our heads, our eyebrows, our eyelashes, the variable patterns of body hair that differ between individuals, these aren't random. Each patch of retained hair serves a specific function. Head hair protects the brain, our most heat-sensitive organ, from both overheating and freezing. Eyebrows keep salt-laden sweat from running into our eyes during exertion. Eyelashes guard against airborne particles. The hair in our armpits and groin helps disperse pheromones, chemical signals that may still play a subtle role in attraction and social bonding even today. We are, in essence, strategically hairless. We lost the fur where it would have prevented effective cooling, but kept it where it served crucial protective or signalling functions. This wasn't random chance. This was natural selection operating with precision over hundreds of thousands of years, sculpting our bodies to meet very specific challenges. But what were those challenges? What happened in our ancestors' environment that made such a dramatic transformation not just possible, but necessary? What changed in their way of life that created selection pressure strong enough to override millions of years of primate evolution? That's what we're going to explore. We're going to examine every major theory about why humans lost their fur. We'll look at the evidence supporting each one, the problems with each explanation, and how they might fit together into a coherent story. We'll travel back through time to the hot African savannas, wade through hypothetical shorelines, consider the threat of tiny parasites, and examine how mate choice shapes evolution just as powerfully as any environmental pressure. Most importantly, we're going to understand that this isn't just about appearance. The question of why humans lost their fur is really a question about why we became human in the first place. Because in solving the mystery of our nakedness, we'll discover how vulnerability became our greatest strength, how apparent weakness drove innovation, and how a simple change in body covering set in motion a cascade of adaptations that would eventually put humans on the moon. So close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's journey back through deep time to the moment when our ancestors made one of the most consequential evolutionary shifts in primate history. Let's find out how humans lost their fur, and in losing it, gained the world. Let's go back, way back. 6 million years ago, to a time before smartphones, before cities, before agriculture, before fire, before tools. Back to when your ancestors looked nothing like you. Because if you could somehow travel back to that ancient African forest and encounter one of your direct ancestors, you wouldn't recognize them as human at all. You'd see an ape, a relatively small one, maybe 4 feet tall, walking upright more often than their chimpanzee cousins, but still spending plenty of time in the trees, and they'd be covered, completely covered, in thick, coarse hair from head to toe. This wasn't some kind of evolutionary mistake or primitive condition. This was the standard primate operating system. Hair. Real hair. Not the nearly invisible fuzz that covers most of your body today. Served dozens of critical functions. Dense fur provided insulation against temperature swings, protection from thorns and biting insects, a barrier against ultraviolet radiation, and even played crucial roles in social communication. Your 6 million year old ancestor had a coat of hair covering every inch of skin except the palms, soles, and a few patches on the face. And that hair wasn't decorative, it was survival equipment. We know this because of 2 powerful lines of evidence that let us reconstruct what our hairy past actually looked like. First, there's the genetic evidence. And this is where things get fascinating because you still carry those genes. Right now, in your DNA. Every human alive today still has the complete genetic instructions for growing full body hair. They're right there in your genome, mostly switched off, but occasionally expressing themselves in ways that remind us of our furry heritage. Men with hairy backs, women with hirsutism, children born with hypertrichosis, a rare condition where they're covered in thick body hair from birth. These aren't genetic mistakes, they're evolutionary throwbacks, glimpses of what we all used to look like. The genes responsible for hair growth are ancient, so ancient that we share most of them with mice, dogs, cats, every other mammal on the planet. The specific variants that regulate human hair growth patterns diverged from our chimpanzee cousins around 6 to 7 million years ago. And those early variants coded for full body coverage. Here's what makes this particularly interesting. When scientists compare the genetic sequences responsible for hair growth across primate species, humans stand out like a sore thumb. We have all the genes for thick body hair, all of them. We just have additional regulatory sequences, genetic switches, that suppress their expression over most of our bodies. It's like having a fully functional car sitting in your garage with the emergency brake permanently engaged. All the parts work. They're just being held back by a few extra control mechanisms that evolved relatively recently. This tells us something crucial. Hair loss in humans wasn't about losing the genes for hair. It was about evolving new switches that turned those genes off in specific locations. The machinery for making fur is still there. We just stopped using most of it. The second line of evidence comes from comparative anatomy. Look at a chimpanzee. Really look at one. Under that dark fur, their skin is pale, almost white. The hair isn't just decoration. It's protection from the sun, insulation against cold nights, a barrier against insects and parasites, a canvas for social signaling. Now look at human skin color distribution across different populations. The darkest skin pigmentation appears in populations that have lived near the equator for the longest time. This is a clue, a big one. If our ancestors had kept their fur, they wouldn't have needed dark skin. The hair would have provided protection from ultraviolet radiation. The fact that populations develop dark skin after losing their hair tells us something important about the sequence of events. The hair loss came first. The pigmentation adaptation came later. Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It responds to immediate problems. And the immediate problem created by losing fur was that suddenly, naked skin was exposed to levels of ultraviolet radiation that could cause serious damage. But what exactly did that ancestral fur do for our early ancestors? Why was it so important that every primate species kept it for millions of years? Let's start with thermoregulation. Fur is one of nature's most sophisticated climate control systems. It works both ways, keeping heat in when it's cold, keeping heat out when it's hot. Those dense layers of hair trap air close to the skin, creating an insulating barrier that moderates temperature changes. On a cold night in the African forest, when temperatures could drop to 50 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, that fur would have been the difference between comfortable sleep and life-threatening hypothermia. Your ancestor would huddle in a sleeping nest, and that thick coat would hold their body heat close, preventing dangerous heat loss through the long dark hours. But it wasn't just about staying warm. During the heat of the day, properly maintained fur actually helps keep you cool. The hair creates a barrier between direct sunlight and the skin, preventing solar radiation from heating the body directly. Watch a lion or wolf in the summer. They don't lose their coats. The fur shades their skin, allowing air circulation underneath while blocking the most intense heat. Our ancestors' fur would have worked the same way, as long as they stayed in forested environments with plenty of shade and limited their activity during the hottest parts of the day. In that context, fur was a net positive. It protected them without overheating them. Then there's physical protection. Primate fur isn't soft and fluffy like a rabbit's. It's coarse, sometimes wiry, dense enough to deflect thorns, prevent insect bites, cushion minor impacts. When you're moving through thick vegetation, climbing trees with rough bark, sitting on rocky ground, that layer of hair prevents countless small injuries that could lead to infections. And in a world before antibiotics, before even basic first aid, infection was a death sentence. Anything that prevented wounds was selected for strongly by natural selection. Parasites were another major concern. This seems counterintuitive at first. We tend to think of fur as harbouring parasites, and it can. But well-maintained primate fur actually provides a first line of defence. The hair creates a physical barrier that makes it harder for ticks, mites and other ectoparasites to reach the skin. It's not perfect protection, but it's something. Modern great apes spend hours every day grooming, picking through each other's fur to remove parasites and debris. This isn't just hygienic, it's social. Grooming bonds strengthen group cohesion, establish hierarchies, maintain alliances. For our furry ancestors, that coat of hair was the foundation of their entire social system. It provided the substrate for one of the most important social behaviours in primate life. And speaking of social systems, fur provided crucial communication functions. Primate hair isn't uniform. It forms patterns, highlights, colour variations that help individuals recognise each other. It can be raised when an animal is angry or frightened, making them look larger and more threatening, a behaviour called piloerection that humans still experience as goosebumps, even though we don't have enough hair for it to be effective anymore. Fur changes texture and appearance with age, providing visible signals about an individual's maturity and health status. Chimpanzees have distinctive facial hair patterns, lighter-coloured beards, expressive eyebrow regions. Gorillas develop silver backs as they mature, a clear signal of dominance and breeding status that can be seen from a distance. Our ancestors almost certainly had similar markings, hair patterns. that helped them navigate complex social hierarchies without constant conflict. In a species that lived in groups where cooperation was essential for survival, these visual signals would have been invaluable. So when did we start losing all this functional, socially important, protective body hair? The honest answer is we don't know exactly. Hair doesn't fossilize. You can't dig up a 3 million-year-old skeleton and tell whether it was furry or naked. But we can make educated guesses based on indirect evidence, and those guesses point to a surprisingly recent timeline. The earliest hominid species, Sahelanthropus, Orrorin, creatures who lived 6 to 7 million years ago, were almost certainly fully furred. They lived in forests, moved like other apes, faced the same environmental challenges as their primate, cousins. There was no reason to lose the hair, no selection pressure pushing them toward nakedness. Even Australopithecus species, who lived from about 4 to 2 million years ago, probably retained most of their body hair. Yes, they were spending more time on the ground, walking upright more consistently than their ancestors, but they were still relatively small-bodied, still living in mixed woodland and savanna environments, where fur would have provided more benefits than drawbacks. Lucy, the famous Australopithecus afarensis skeleton from 3.2 million years ago, was probably furry. We can't know for certain, but everything about her lifestyle and environment suggests that losing fur wouldn't have been advantageous yet. The shift probably began somewhere between 2 and 1.5 million years ago, with the emergence of the genus Homo. Early Homo species like Homo habilis, and especially Homo erectus, showed significant changes in body proportions. They were taller, more linear, with longer legs relative to their torsos. This is a body plan optimized for efficient walking and running, for covering long distances, for moving through open environments. And here's where the problem with fur becomes apparent. When you commit to a tall, upright body plan, adapted for hot, open environments, fur starts becoming a liability. The same insulation that kept you warm at night now traps heat during the day. The same barrier that protected you from minor scrapes now prevents your body from cooling efficiently. And in the hot, exposed landscapes where these early Homo species were living, overheating became a more serious threat than cold or minor injuries. The genetic evidence supports this timeline. Studies of genes responsible for skin pigmentation, particularly the MC1R gene that controls melanin production, suggest that dark skin evolved somewhere between 1.2 and 1.8 million years ago. This is crucial because, as we mentioned earlier, dark skin only becomes necessary after you lose the protective hair. Pale skin under thick fur handles ultraviolet radiation just fine. Pale skin exposed to direct equatorial sunlight. That's a recipe for skin cancer, severe sunburn, and destroyed folate, a vitamin essential for DNA synthesis and fetal development. So the presence of genes for dark skin tells us that by 1.2 million years ago, our ancestors had lost enough fur that their skin needed pigmentation for protection. Natural selection would have acted fast in this scenario. Within probably just a few thousand generations, human populations remaining in Africa had evolved very dark skin. Not a tan that fades when you stay indoors, but genetic changes that made their skin cells produce massive amounts of melanin permanently. By the time Homo heidelbergensis appeared around 700,000 years ago, our ancestors were probably mostly hairless. Not completely naked, they almost certainly retained head hair to protect the brain from overheating and sun damage, kept eyebrows to channel sweat away from the eyes, maintained eyelashes to protect against dust and debris, likely had some body hair, particularly in areas associated with scent glands like the armpits and groin. But the dense primate standard body hair, gone. Our ancestors had become, by primate standards, bizarrely naked. And this transformation was fundamentally different from what happened in other hairless mammals. Elephants lost their fur because they're massive and live in hot climates. Their huge body size means they have trouble dissipating heat, and fur would make the problem worse. Whales and dolphins lost their fur because it's useless in water. Wet fur loses its insulating properties and creates drag. Naked mole rats lost their fur because they live in underground colonies, with stable temperatures and high parasite transmission rates. But humans? We're medium-sized land animals. We're not so large that fur would cause overheating just from body mass. We're not aquatic. We don't live underground in stable microclimates. We lost our fur for reasons that are specific to our particular evolutionary path, our unique ecological niche, our distinctive way of life. Those remnants we still carry tell a story. The hair on your head isn't a leftover, It's maintained by active selection because it serves important functions, protecting your brain from temperature extremes, providing some protection from the sun, possibly playing roles in mate choice and social signalling. Your eyebrows aren't random. They're precisely positioned to channel sweat away from your eyes, allowing you to maintain vision during intense physical activity. The hair in your armpits and groin isn't vestigial. These areas contain specialized apocrine sweat glands that produce thicker, odor-causing secretions. The hair in these regions helps disperse those scents, broadcasting chemical signals about your age, sex, and possibly your emotional state. We don't fully understand human pheromone communication, but the fact that we've retained hair specifically in areas rich with scent glands suggests it still serves some function. Even the fine vellus hair that covers most of your body, the nearly invisible peach fuzz that you can feel if you run your hand along your arm, serves a purpose. It allows you to detect the presence of tiny insects crawling on your skin while simultaneously inhibiting their movement. It's hair that's been optimized for parasite detection rather than insulation or protection. We are strategically hairless. Evolution didn't strip away our fur randomly or completely. It sculpted our hair coverage with precision, removing it where it interfered with new adaptations while maintaining it where it continued to serve important functions. This suggests that the evolutionary pressures driving hair loss were strong, consistent, and acting over a long enough period that natural selection could fine-tune the result. But here's what really stands out when you look at the big picture. We lost our fur during the most important period of human evolution, the period when brain size was rapidly increasing, when tool use was becoming sophisticated, when group sizes were growing larger, when our ancestors were spreading from Africa into new environments with entirely different climates and challenges. Hair loss wasn't happening in isolation. It was part of a package of changes that transformed an ape into something unprecedented. And understanding why we lost our fur means understanding what drove that entire transformation. It means figuring out what was so special about that period between 2 million and 500,000 years ago that it produced a naked, sweating, big-brained ape that would eventually dominate the planet. The furry past we've left behind isn't just ancient history. It's written into our genes, visible in our remaining patches of hair, evident in the ways our bodies respond to temperature and stress. Every time you get goosebumps, you're experiencing a vestigial response that would have made your ancestors' fur stand on end. Every time you shiver, you're triggering a behavior designed to generate heat in a fur-covered body. We are, in a very real sense, apes who've forgotten how to be apes. We've lost the fur that defined our lineage for millions of years, and in losing it, we gained something else, something that would prove far more valuable than any amount of protective hair could ever be. Now, we come to the theory that most scientists accept as at least part of the answer. The Savannah Hypothesis. And it begins with a simple observation. Sometime between 6 million years ago and today, Africa changed dramatically. The climate shifted from wet to dry, forests shrank, and in their place, vast grasslands spread across the continent. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow, grinding transformation that took millions of years. But for the primates living through it, the change was profound. Imagine being an early hominid 6 million years ago. Your world is forest. Dense, shaded, humid forest, where you can move from tree to tree, rarely exposing yourself to direct sunlight for long periods. Food is scattered but predictable. Fruits, leaves, insects, whatever you can reach from the trees or find on the forest floor. The temperature stays relatively moderate because the canopy blocks most of the sun's intensity. Life isn't easy, but it's manageable for a furry ape. Then the climate begins to dry, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. But year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the forests thin. Trees die and aren't replaced. Open spaces appear where dense vegetation once stood. And gradually your descendants face a choice: retreat with the shrinking forests, competing ever more desperately for limited resources in the remaining woodland patches, or adapt to the new environment, learn to survive in the open grasslands where no tree-dwelling ape has gone before. Some populations chose the first option. They stayed in the forests, evolved into modern chimpanzees and bonobos, and remain there today. But one lineage, our lineage, took the risk. They moved out into the open, and this decision changed everything. The savannah wasn't like the forest, not even close. In the trees, you could move from one shady spot to another, rarely exposing yourself to direct sunlight for extended periods. You could rest during the hottest hours, becoming active in the cooler morning and evening. But out on the grasslands, there was nowhere to hide from the sun. If you wanted to find food, you had to walk for miles under brutal heat. If you wanted to hunt, you had to chase prey across open ground with no shade breaks, no respite, no escape from the relentless sun beating down on your back. And here's where the problem with fur becomes obvious. Body hair is excellent insulation when you need to stay warm. It traps a layer of air close to your skin, preventing heat from escaping during cold nights. But when you're exercising in 100-degree heat, that same insulation becomes a death trap. Fur holds heat close to your body, preventing it from dissipating into the air. Your internal temperature rises, your organs begin to cook. Your brain, the most temperature-sensitive organ in your body, approaches the point where proteins start to denature and cells begin dying. Modern chimpanzees deal with this problem by avoiding midday activity entirely. They rest in the shade during the hottest hours, only moving around during cooler morning and evening periods when the risk of overheating is lower. It's a sensible strategy for a furred animal. But our ancestors couldn't afford that luxury, because around the same time they were moving into the savannas, they were developing something revolutionary: bipedalism, walking upright on two legs. This adaptation is usually explained in terms of efficiency. Walking on two legs uses less energy than knuckle walking on all fours, letting you cover more ground with less effort, and that's true. But bipedalism had another crucial advantage that's often overlooked. It reduced sun exposure. Think about it geometrically. When a chimpanzee walks on all fours, its entire back is exposed to direct overhead sunlight. That's a huge surface area absorbing solar radiation. But when you stand upright, only your head and shoulders get hit by the midday sun. Everything else is shielded by your own body. This reduces heat load by roughly 60%. That's enormous. It's the difference between overheating in an hour and being able to walk for several hours. But even with reduced sun exposure, the savanna was still brutally hot. And this is where hairlessness enters the picture. Our ancestors needed a better cooling system, and nature had already provided the solution: sweating. Now, lots of animals sweat, but most mammals only have sweat, glands in limited locations like their paws, and the sweat glands they do have are called apocrine glands, which produce thick, oily sweat that's great for scent communication, but pretty useless for cooling. Humans are different. We're covered in eccrine sweat glands, millions of them distributed across our entire body surface. These glands produce thin, watery sweat that evaporates quickly, carrying heat away from the skin with incredible efficiency. It's one of the most effective cooling systems in the animal kingdom. But here's the crucial detail. Eccrine sweat glands only work efficiently on bare skin. If you're covered in thick fur, the sweat gets trapped in the hair where it just sits there, being useless, making you wet and uncomfortable without actually cooling you down. For sweating to work as a cooling mechanism, you need exposed skin where the moisture can evaporate freely into the air. So the hypothesis goes like this. As our ancestors adapted to savanna life and developed bipedalism, natural selection began favouring individuals with less body hair and more eccrine sweat glands. These individuals could stay active during the hottest parts of the day. They could walk farther to find food. They could travel between water sources. They could hunt more effectively. Most importantly, they could practice what anthropologists call persistence hunting. And this might have been the game changer, the hunting strategy that drove human evolution more than any other factor. Here's how persistence hunting works. You pick out a target animal, usually something like an antelope or kudu, a hoofed mammal that's faster than you in short sprints but can't sweat effectively. Then you just start jogging after it. Not sprinting, just a steady jog that you can maintain for hours. The animal bolts, running at full speed until it's far ahead of you, panting heavily, overheating. But you keep jogging. Your bare skin is sweating. Your eccrine glands are pumping out moisture. That moisture evaporates in the hot, dry air, carrying heat away from your body. You're cooling down continuously, never needing to stop. Eventually, you catch up to the animal again. It sees you coming and runs away again, sprinting until it's exhausted, until its internal temperature is dangerously high, until its muscles are screaming for oxygen, and you keep jogging, over and over, for hours, sometimes for an entire day. The animal is faster than you in short bursts, but it can't maintain that speed. It has to stop frequently to pant, to let its body temperature drop, because panting is the only way it can cool down. Meanwhile, you never stop. You can jog for hours without overheating, because you're cooling down through evaporative sweating. You're losing heat as fast as you're generating it. Eventually, inevitably, the animal simply collapses from heat exhaustion. Its internal temperature has risen to dangerous levels, its muscles stop working properly, and you walk up and kill it, with a spear or a rock. It sounds brutal because it is, but it's also remarkably effective. Modern hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert still practice persistence hunting, and they can bring down animals that would be impossible to catch any other way, animals that are faster, stronger, better armed than humans. But none of that matters if you can run them into heat stroke, and this hunting strategy only works if you're hairless and covered in eccrine sweat glands. With fur, you'd overheat and collapse long before your prey did. Without fur, you become the most dangerous endurance predator on the planet. You become an animal that can kill through sheer stamina, through the simple refusal to stop moving. The paleoclimate evidence supports this scenario. Between 3 and 4 million years ago, we see a dramatic expansion of grasslands across East Africa. This timing matches perfectly with the fossil record showing our ancestors developing bipedalism and leaving the forests. By 2 million years ago, we have early Homo species that show clear adaptations for long-distance running. Changed leg proportions, modified foot architecture, enlarged gluteus maximus muscles for stabilizing the trunk during running. These are the bodies of persistence hunters, and they would have needed hairlessness to make the strategy work. But the Savannah Hypothesis explains more than just hunting. It was about surviving in a completely new environment where the old rules didn't apply. In the forest, overheating was rarely a problem, but dehydration was constant. Water sources were scattered and unreliable. Our savanna-adapted ancestors needed to travel long distances between water holes, often carrying food or tools with them, walking for hours in direct sunlight. Without an efficient cooling system, this would have been impossible. With hairlessness and eccrine sweating, it became routine. The genetic evidence adds another piece to the puzzle. Studies of skin pigmentation genes suggest that humans developed dark skin around 1.2 million years ago, right around the time we were losing most of our body hair. This makes perfect sense. Body hair protects against ultraviolet radiation. Once you lose that protection, you need something else to prevent skin damage and skin cancer. Dark skin, loaded with melanin pigment that absorbs and scatters UV rays, provided that protection. So the sequence probably went like this. First, savanna adaptation drove our ancestors into more open environments. Second, bipedalism evolved to improve efficiency and reduce sun exposure. Third came gradual hair loss combined with increased sweating capacity, allowing extended activity in hot conditions. Fourth, darker skin pigmentation evolved to protect newly exposed skin from sun damage. Each adaptation building on the previous ones, creating a complete package optimized for surviving in open, hot environments. But as compelling as the Savannah Hypothesis sounds, it's not, without problems. The biggest criticism is that the timeline doesn't quite match up. We know our ancestors were bipedal by about 4 million years ago, based on fossils and the famous Litoli footprints from Tanzania. But the most dramatic reduction in body hair probably didn't happen until much later, maybe 1 to 2 million years ago. That's a huge gap, 2 or 3 million years, between developing bipedalism and losing most of the fur. If hairlessness was immediately advantageous for bipedal savanna-living primates, why did it take so long to evolve? Some researchers suggest the early bipedal hominins might have retained their fur because they were still living partially in woodland environments, only moving into fully open savannas much later. The Australopithecines, despite being bipedal, might have spent significant time in trees and forests where fur was still beneficial. Only when Homo erectus emerged around 2 million years ago, with their fully modern body proportions and commitment to terrestrial life, did hairlessness become strongly advantageous. Others think hairlessness might have evolved in stages, with different body regions losing hair at different times and for different reasons. Perhaps the back and shoulders lost hair first to improve cooling efficiency, while other areas retained fur for longer because they still served useful functions. This would explain why we see such variable body hair patterns in modern humans. Different populations might represent different stages of an ongoing evolutionary process. Another problem is that not all populations living in hot, open environments are particularly hairless. Aboriginal Australians lived in conditions very similar to the African savanna for tens of thousands of years, but they retained normal human body hair patterns. They didn't evolve to become more hairy, which is what you'd expect if the Savannah hypothesis was completely wrong. But they also didn't evolve to become completely smooth-skinned, which is what you'd expect if hairlessness was purely an adaptation to hot, open environments. This suggests that once hairlessness evolved, it became fixed in human populations regardless of local climate conditions. The trait spread throughout humanity, not because it was optimal for every environment, but because it was good enough for most environments, and the benefits in some contexts outweighed the cost in others. Or perhaps hairlessness became linked to other important traits through genetic pleiotropy, where one gene affects multiple characteristics, making it difficult to reverse even when it wasn't optimal. Then there's the question of persistence hunting itself. While it's true that some modern hunter-gatherers practice this technique, it's far from universal. Many successful hunting societies have never used persistence hunting at all. The San people of the Kalahari, who are often cited as examples of persistence hunters, actually obtain most of their meat through other methods: ambush hunting, trapping, using poison-tipped arrows. Persistence hunting happens, but it's relatively rare even among people who could theoretically do it. So maybe persistence hunting wasn't as important to human evolution as the hypothesis suggests. Maybe hairlessness evolved for different reasons, and persistence hunting was just a useful side benefit that some populations figured out how to exploit. The cooling advantage of bare skin would have been valuable for any extended activity in hot conditions, not just for chasing down prey. Walking to water sources, gathering plant foods, moving camp, defending territory, all of these activities would have benefited from efficient thermoregulation. Despite these criticisms, the Savannah hypothesis remains the most widely accepted explanation for human hairlessness. It connects multiple lines of evidence into a coherent narrative. Climate change driving habitat change favouring bipedalism creating thermal challenges selecting for hairlessness, and improved sweating. Each step follows logically from the previous one, and the end result, hairless, sweating, long-distance capable humans, matches exactly what we see in the fossil and genetic records. But science is never about finding one perfect explanation and declaring victory. It's about testing hypotheses, identifying problems, refining our understanding. The Savannah hypothesis might explain much of human hairlessness, but it probably isn't the whole story. Other factors, other selective pressures, other evolutionary forces were almost certainly involved, and that's what makes this mystery so fascinating. We're not just asking why humans lost their fur, we're asking what it means to be human. How did we become this strange, hairless, sweating species that can run for hours under the blazing sun? What combination of environmental pressures and random mutations and selective advantages created something so unique in the mammalian world? The Savannah hypothesis gives us part of the answer. It explains why hairlessness would have been advantageous in the specific environment where our ancestors lived. It connects hair loss to other important adaptations like bipedalism and enhanced sweating. It provides a mechanism, thermoregulation for endurance activities, that makes logical sense and is supported by evidence from modern hunter-gatherers. But it's not the complete picture. Because evolution is messy, it's complex. It involves multiple pressures working simultaneously, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes pulling in different directions, and the full story of human hairlessness is more nuanced, more interesting, and far more complicated than any single explanation can capture. The Savannah hypothesis opened the door to understanding why we're naked, but there are other theories waiting to be explored, other pieces of the puzzle that need to fit together before we can truly understand this defining feature of human evolution. Now we come to one of the most controversial ideas in human evolution, a theory that mainstream science has rejected repeatedly, that most anthropologists won't even discuss seriously, but that keeps refusing to die, the Aquatic Ape Theory. And here's what makes it fascinating. It explains certain features of human anatomy so elegantly, so perfectly, that you almost want it to be true, even though it probably isn't. The basic idea goes like this. Sometime between 7 and 8 million years ago, our ancestors weren't living on the African savanna at all. They were living along coastlines, in estuaries, around lakes and rivers, spending significant time in shallow water. not as fully aquatic creatures like dolphins or seals, but as semi-aquatic primates who waded through tidal pools, foraged for shellfish, used water as a refuge from predators, and during this aquatic phase, lasting perhaps millions of years, they lost their fur, because fur is useful on land but becomes a liability in water. The theory was first proposed by marine biologist Alistair Hardy in 1960, then developed extensively by writer Elaine Morgan starting in the 1970s, and from the moment it was published, the scientific establishment hated it, absolutely despised it. Paleoanthropologists lined up to tear it apart, calling it speculative, unfalsifiable, based on superficial similarities rather than solid evidence. The rejection was so thorough, so complete, that the theory essentially became radioactive. Even mentioning it could damage a young scientist's career. But here's the thing, Morgan and Hardy were asking legitimate questions. Questions that mainstream theories struggle to answer satisfactorily. Start with the most obvious one. Why are humans the only primates without fur? Every other ape, gorillas, chimps, orangutans, they're all covered in thick body hair, but humans are basically naked. The Savannah Hypothesis says we lost our fur to stay cool while running in open grasslands, but plenty of savanna mammals have fur. Zebras, wildebeest, lions, they all manage just fine with full coats. So why did only humans need to become naked? The Aquatic Ape Theory offers a different answer. Look at aquatic mammals. Dolphins, whales, hippos, manatees, walruses. What do they all have in common? They're hairless or nearly hairless. Marine mammals lose their fur because it becomes a liability in water. Wet fur loses its insulating properties almost completely. It creates drag when swimming. It traps water against the skin, causing rapid heat loss. Far better to lose the fur entirely and develop other adaptations, like thick layers of subcutaneous fat for insulation. And this is where the theory gets interesting. Because humans are weird among primates. We have a layer of fat directly beneath our skin that's far thicker than any other ape. Chimpanzees and gorillas are basically all muscle. Their skin sits right against their muscle tissue with minimal fat in between. Even lean humans have significant subcutaneous fat. Babies are born chubby, with fat reserves that seem excessive for a terrestrial mammal. You know what other mammals have extensive subcutaneous fat? Aquatic ones. Seals, whales, hippos. They use this fat layer for insulation in water where fur won't work. The fat provides buoyancy, helps with temperature regulation in cold water, serves as an energy reserve during long periods of swimming or diving. Humans have exactly this adaptation, a layer of fat that seems designed for an aquatic lifestyle rather than a terrestrial one. Then there's breath control. Humans are the only primates who can consciously control their breathing. Chimpanzees can't do it. Gorillas can't do it. Try to teach a chimpanzee to hold its breath or blow out a candle. It simply can't figure out what you want. The neural circuitry for voluntary breath control doesn't exist in other primates. But human babies can hold their breath underwater from birth. It's an instinctive response called the bradycardic reflex. You dunk a newborn in water, and they automatically seal their airways and stop breathing. This is strongest in infants, exactly when it would be most useful if our ancestors were semi-aquatic. Adult humans can train themselves to hold their breath for minutes at a time. Freediver regularly go 4, 5, even 10 minutes without breathing. This isn't normal for a terrestrial mammal, but it's completely normal for semi-aquatic ones. Otters, seals, hippos, they all have sophisticated breath control that lets them forage underwater. Humans have this ability too, which seems strange if we evolved entirely on dry land. The theory goes further. Consider our body shape. Humans have relatively long legs compared to other apes. Our legs are built for forward motion, for bipedal striding. But they're also pretty good for wading through shallow water. Stand a human, a chimp, and a gorilla in chest-deep water and watch what happens. The chimp and gorilla panic, struggling to keep their heads above water, clearly uncomfortable. The human instinctively stands upright, walks forward, uses the water to support their body weight. It feels natural because our proportions are well suited for it. Or look at our hands. Human hands have partially webbed fingers. Not dramatically webbed like a duck's foot, but there's definitely a membrane connecting the base of each finger. Other apes don't have this. Their fingers are separate almost to the base. Why would humans have vestigial webbing if we'd never spent significant time in water? It's a small detail, but it's the kind of detail that makes you wonder. The theory even tries to explain human babies' relationship with water. Human infants are born helpless, unable to cling to their mothers the way other ape babies can. Put a newborn chimp on its mother's chest, and it'll grab her fur and hold on. Put a newborn human on their mother's chest and they slide right off. We lack the gripping reflex that all other primates have. But human babies are natural swimmers. From birth, they can coordinate their limbs in a swimming motion, hold their breath underwater, seem remarkably comfortable in aquatic environments, as if that's where we evolved to spend our earliest months. Morgan and Hardy even proposed specific geographic locations for this aquatic phase. They suggested the East African Rift Valley during a period when it was flooded by lakes and inland seas, or the shores of the Mediterranean where sea levels fluctuated dramatically over millions of years, or coastal regions of Africa where early hominins might have exploited rich marine resources, places where our ancestors could have waded through shallow waters, diving for shellfish, catching fish in tidal pools, using the water as protection from terrestrial predators. The archaeological record does show that early humans exploited aquatic resources extensively. Shell middens, massive piles of discarded shellfish shells, appear at human sites going back hundreds of thousands of years. Coastal populations seem to have relied heavily on marine resources. Some researchers think the omega-3 fatty acids from seafood might have been crucial for brain development, providing the nutritional foundation for our large, metabolically expensive brains. So why does mainstream science reject this theory so thoroughly? Because despite decades of searching, nobody has found the smoking gun. No fossils of semi-aquatic hominins with obvious aquatic adaptations, no skeletal features that clearly indicate diving or swimming as a primary mode of locomotion, no deposits of human remains in ancient lake beds or coastal sites that would confirm prolonged aquatic living. The fossil record, sparse as it is, shows early humans in savanna environments, not aquatic ones. The few coastal sites we've found with human remains date to relatively recent periods, tens of thousands of years ago, not millions. If humans spent a significant aquatic phase in their evolutionary history, where's the evidence? Where are the fossils of wading hominins? Where are the bones showing adaptations for swimming? The mainstream scientific community has been brutal in its rejection. Paleoanthropologists point out that every supposed aquatic adaptation can be explained in other ways. Hairlessness, thermoregulation on open grasslands, subcutaneous fat, energy storage during periods of food scarcity, not aquatic insulation, breath control, a byproduct of the neural circuitry required for complex speech, bipedalism, efficient long-distance walking, not wading. Each individual piece of evidence crumbles under scrutiny. And the theory has a methodological problem. It cherry-picks similarities between humans and aquatic mammals while ignoring all the ways we're different. We don't have flippers, we don't have streamlined body shapes, we don't have the massive lung capacity of diving mammals. We don't have salt glands for excreting excess salt from seawater. We don't have any of the dozens of specific adaptations that true aquatic mammals possess. The similarities are superficial, the kind of convergent evolution you'd expect from any mammal that spent some time in water, not evidence of a dedicated aquatic phase lasting millions of years. It's like saying bats must have evolved from birds because they both have wings. The similarity doesn't prove shared lifestyle, just convergent solutions to similar problems. Most damningly, the theory requires a massive gap in the fossil record. If humans spent millions of years as semi-aquatic creatures, where are the transitional fossils? Where are the proto-humans with intermediate adaptations? The fossil record isn't complete, but it's not that incomplete. We've found fossils of early hominins in all sorts of environments, from forests to grasslands to lake margins. None of them show clear aquatic specializations, yet the theory won't die. It keeps coming back, keeps attracting supporters, keeps generating debate. Why? Because it explains certain things so elegantly. The hairlessness, the fat, the breath control, the ease with which humans take to water, babies who can swim before they can walk, adults who can train themselves to free dive to extraordinary depths, populations around the world who live almost amphibious lifestyles, spending hours each day in water, diving for food, seeming as comfortable swimming as walking. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe our ancestors weren't fully aquatic, but they weren't fully terrestrial either. Maybe they were what ecologists call facultative aquatic, creatures equally comfortable on land and in water, exploiting resources from both environments. Early humans living along lake shores and coastlines, wading through shallows to gather shellfish, diving for sea urchins, catching fish in tidal pools. Not spending enough time in water to become truly aquatic, but enough to lose their fur and develop some water-friendly adaptations. There's some genetic evidence for this compromise position. Studies of human populations that have lived by water for thousands of years show adaptations for diving and swimming. The Bahau people of Southeast Asia, who spend up to 5 hours a day underwater fishing, have evolved larger spleens that store oxygenated blood, allowing longer dive times. This suggests humans can adapt to aquatic lifestyles relatively quickly, and that such adaptations might have occurred repeatedly throughout our evolutionary history. So maybe the aquatic ape theory isn't entirely wrong. Maybe it's just overstated. Maybe our ancestors did spend significant time in and around water, enough to influence our evolution in subtle but important ways. Not enough to turn us into seals or dolphins, but enough to make us the only apes who can swim naturally, hold our breath consciously, walk upright, through chest-deep water without panic. The scientific community still rejects the theory in its strong form, the version that claims we had a dedicated aquatic phase lasting millions of years. But elements of it, the recognition that early humans exploited aquatic resources extensively, that water may have played a bigger role in our evolution than previously thought, these ideas are slowly being incorporated into mainstream thinking. Not as a replacement for the Savannah Hypothesis, but as a complement to it. A recognition that human evolution was complex, multifaceted, influenced by many environments and many selective pressures. Maybe we didn't need to be fully aquatic to lose our fur. Maybe we just needed to spend enough time in water that hairlessness became advantageous, combined with heat stress on the savanna, combined with parasite pressure, combined with sexual selection, combined with a dozen other factors we haven't even considered yet. Because that's how evolution actually works, not through single dramatic adaptations, but through gradual accumulation of changes driven by complex overlapping environmental pressures. Maybe we didn't need to choose between being savanna apes or aquatic apes. Maybe we were both, moving between environments as conditions dictated, exploiting resources wherever we could find them. The aquatic ape theory, controversial as it is, reminds us to look beyond the obvious answers, to consider all the environments our ancestors inhabited, all the challenges they faced, all the resources they exploited. Because the truth is always more complicated than any single theory can capture, and even wrong theories can ask the right questions, can point us toward aspects of human evolution we might otherwise overlook. Human hairlessness probably doesn't have a single simple explanation. It's the product of multiple evolutionary pressures working together over millions of years. The aquatic ape theory might not be right, but it's asking us to think broadly, to consider every possibility, to remember that our ancestors were adaptable creatures living in diverse environments, not rigid specialists locked into a single ecological niche. And that adaptability, the ability to exploit multiple environments, to switch between land and water and forest and grassland as opportunities arose, that might be the real key to understanding how we lost our fur and became human. Now let's talk about something less romantic than running across sunlit savannas or wading through ancient shorelines. Let's talk about parasites, specifically the tiny disease-carrying creatures that see your body as their personal planet. Lice crawling through thick hair, laying eggs that hatch into more lice. Ticks burrowing into skin wherever fur is thick enough to hide them. Fleas jumping from individual to individual whenever groups huddle together. Mites living in hair follicles, feeding on oils and dead skin cells. And this isn't just about being uncomfortable. These parasites kill, they carry diseases that have devastated human populations throughout history. Typhus, spread by body lice, has killed millions. Plague, carried by fleas, wiped out entire civilizations. Lyme disease, delivered by ticks, can damage your heart, your nervous system, your joints. In the tropical environments where our ancestors lived, the parasite load on furred mammals is staggering. Modern primates in equatorial Africa can carry dozens of different parasite species simultaneously, each one draining energy, transmitting pathogens, reducing the host's ability to survive and reproduce. Now imagine you're a member of an early human group trying to transition from forest living to open savanna environments. You're spending more time in the sun, walking upright through tall grasses where ticks wait to drop onto passing animals. You're starting to live in larger social groups, sleeping close together at night, which means parasites can spread faster than ever before. And you're developing the cognitive capacity to notice patterns, to observe that some individuals seem healthier than others, that some people are constantly scratching while others have clearer skin. Natural selection is brutal in these situations. It doesn't care about your comfort or your feelings, it only cares about reproduction. And if parasites are reducing your health, making you weak, giving you fever, covering you in sores that could become infected, you're less likely to survive long enough to have children. Even if you do survive, you're less attractive as a potential mate because visible signs of parasite infestation advertise poor health and weak immune function. This is where the parasite hypothesis gets interesting. Some anthropologists, particularly evolutionary scientist Mark Pagel at the University of Reading, argue that hair loss wasn't primarily about cooling or swimming. It was about creating an environment where parasites couldn't thrive. Think about the difference between a furred surface and bare skin from a parasite's perspective. Fur provides everything a parasite needs: insulation from temperature extremes, darkness and humidity, countless hiding places where you can feed without being detected, hair shafts to grip onto, protected spaces to lay eggs. It's the perfect habitat for lice, which need to stay attached to hair to survive. It's ideal for ticks, which can burrow deep into thick fur and feed for days without being noticed. It's heaven for fleas, which can lay eggs in the thick undergrowth of body hair and jump between hosts easily. Bare skin, by contrast, is a hostile environment for parasites. No place to hide, no hair shafts to grip. Any tick or louse on bare skin is immediately visible and vulnerable to being picked off. The sun hits the skin directly, creating temperatures too high for many parasites to survive. Rain washes away eggs and larvae that would otherwise be protected by fur. Wind dries out the skin surface, making it inhospitable to moisture-loving parasites. The selection pressure would have been intense. Individuals with less body hair would have lower parasite loads. They'd be healthier, more energetic, better able to hunt and gather. They'd have fewer disease outbreaks. Crucially, they'd be more attractive to potential mates because visible health became easier to assess. This is sexual selection at its most pragmatic. You're not looking for the most colourful plumage or the most elaborate display. You're looking for clear skin, smooth parasite-free skin that signals a healthy immune system and low disease risk. In environments where parasites are a major cause of death and disability, choosing a mate with visible evidence of parasite resistance could be the difference between your children surviving or dying young. Clear skin becomes an honest signal of genetic quality because you can't fake it. If you're carrying a heavy parasite load, it shows. Your skin looks unhealthy, you're constantly scratching, you move sluggishly because parasites are draining your energy. But if you have naturally lower susceptibility to parasites, that health is visible on your bare skin. The genetic evidence supports this timeline in fascinating ways. We know humans have 3 types of lice: head lice, which live in scalp hair, body lice, which live in clothing and only visit skin to feed, and pubic lice, which are actually more closely related to gorilla lice than to other human lice, suggesting we acquired them relatively recently through some kind of close contact, possibly butchering gorillas or sleeping in their abandoned nests. The DNA of these lice species tells us when they diverge from each other, which gives us a timeline for human hair loss and clothing invention. Body lice DNA suggests they split from head lice somewhere between 70,000 and 170,000 years ago. That's when body lice evolved to live in clothing rather than body hair, because there wasn't any body hair left to live in. This means humans had already lost most of their body hair by this point, and had started wearing clothes regularly enough that lice could adapt to this new habitat. Head lice DNA is much older, suggesting they've been with us for millions of years, continuously living in our scalp hair. The fact that we kept head hair but lost body hair is actually strong evidence for the parasite hypothesis. Head hair could be groomed by other group members. Social grooming, where individuals pick through each other's hair removing parasites, is a major behaviour in all primates. It's practical, it's bonding, and it works. You can effectively groom someone's head, carefully searching through their hair for parasites and removing them. But you can't effectively groom your own back, your own legs, your entire body surface. That fur was harbouring parasites you couldn't reach, parasites that could multiply unchecked, parasites that made you sick. By losing body hair but keeping head hair, early humans created a situation where parasites were confined to a manageable area that could be systematically groomed, while eliminating the vast habitat that had existed across the rest of the body. It's actually an elegant compromise. Keep the benefits of hair where it matters most. Eliminate the massive parasite burden of full body fur. The relationship between hair loss and group living intensifies this effect. As human populations began living in larger, more permanent groups, parasite transmission became a more serious problem. When you're a small band of 15 people moving frequently, parasites have limited opportunities to spread. You don't spend enough time in one place for parasite populations to build up. Your sleeping sites are temporary, your contact with others is limited, but when you're a group of 50 or 100 people living in the same location for months, sleeping in close proximity, sharing food and tools, parasites can spread explosively. One infested individual can transmit their parasites to dozens of others within days, and once parasites establish themselves in a large group, they're incredibly difficult to eliminate because reinfection is constant. Modern studies of parasite loads in different mammal species show clear patterns. Species that live in large social groups and have thick fur suffer much higher parasite burdens than solitary species or hairless species. Prairie dogs living in large colonies have high tick and flea loads. Primates living in big troops show more parasite diversity and density than solitary primates. The correlation is consistent. Social living plus fur equals heavy parasite infestation. Humans were moving in the direction of larger groups, denser populations, more social complexity. Every step toward bigger communities increased the selective pressure against body hair. Every generation, the individuals with less hair were slightly healthier because they carried fewer parasites. Their children survived at slightly higher rates. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this cumulative pressure stripped away the fur that our ancestors had carried for millions of years. There's even evidence that hairlessness correlates with reduced disease transmission in modern contexts. Studies comparing infection rates between body regions show that hairy areas, armpits, groin, are more prone to bacterial and fungal infections than hairless areas. The warm, moist environment created by hair provides ideal conditions for pathogens to grow. Smooth, dry skin is much less hospitable to disease-causing organisms. Historical records show that soldiers who shaved body hair in tropical environments had lower rates of certain diseases than those who didn't. Modern military forces sometimes require body hair removal in hot climates, specifically to reduce skin infections and parasite infestations. The same principle that drove human evolution, hairless skin equals fewer parasites, still applies today. Of course, losing hair created new problems. Without fur, humans became vulnerable to sunburn, heat loss at night, injuries from vegetation and insects. But these costs were apparently worth the benefits of reduced parasite load, and humans solved these new problems with technology rather than waiting for biological evolution. Clothing for warmth and protection, shelter for avoiding sun and rain, fire for warmth during cold nights, tools for processing food. Each technological innovation compensated for a vulnerability created by hairlessness. The Parasite Hypothesis also explains some puzzling details about human body hair distribution. We didn't lose all our hair. We kept significant hair in the armpits and groin, areas that coincidentally produce strong scent signals from apocrine glands. This suggests that hair in these regions might have been retained for social signaling, for chemical communication that was important enough to outweigh the parasite costs. We also kept our eyelashes and eyebrows, which serve clear protective functions for our eyes. These hairs are coarse, regularly shed, and much less hospitable to parasites than the fine, dense body fur of our ancestors. They protect without harbouring the ecosystem of parasites that body fur supported, and we kept, as mentioned before, our head hair, which could be long and thick. But head hair is unique. It's the one area of the body where other group members can effectively help with parasite control. Social grooming of head hair became a major bonding behaviour in human societies, something we still see echoes of in hairstyling, haircuts, and the intimacy of touching someone's hair. The timing of hair loss, probably between 1 and 2 million years ago based on skin pigmentation genetics, coincides with other major transitions in human evolution. This is when brain size is increasing rapidly, when tool use is becoming sophisticated, when group sizes are growing, when humans are spreading into new environments with different parasite pressures. It's possible, maybe even likely, that hair loss was part of a package of adaptations that all reinforced each other. Bigger brains needed better cooling, which hairlessness provided. Larger groups needed better parasite control, which hairlessness enabled. More sophisticated social structures benefited from visible health signals, which bare skin revealed. Better tool use allowed clothing manufacture, which compensated for the loss of fur's protective functions. None of these factors alone might have been enough to drive the evolution of hairlessness, but together they created a situation where losing fur provided multiple simultaneous advantages. The parasite reduction benefit alone might not have overcome the costs, but parasite reduction plus better cooling, plus visible health signaling, plus social bonding through head grooming, that combination could have been powerful enough to drive the trait to fixation. Parasites might not have been the only reason we lost our hair, but they were probably a major part of the equation. A constant, deadly evolutionary pressure that shaped our bodies in ways we're still living with today. Every time you look at your smooth arm or leg, you're seeing the result of millions of years of warfare against creatures so small you can barely see them. Creatures that once called your ancestors' fur home. Creatures that our lineage eventually evicted by burning down the house, by stripping away the hair that gave them refuge. And in doing so, we created a new vulnerability, exposed skin that could burn, freeze, or be injured. But we also created an opportunity for technology to replace biology, for culture to evolve faster than genes, for humans to become the only species that can consciously modify its own body covering, choosing when to be protected and when to be bare, adapting to any environment not through millions of years of evolution, but through simple acts of invention and innovation. The war against parasites might have started our journey toward hairlessness, but it ended with us becoming something unprecedented. Naked apes who could survive anywhere, not because our biology was perfectly adapted to every environment, but because our minds were flexible enough to create solutions to any problem, including the problem of being naked in a world designed for fur. Let's step back from the drama of parasites and survival for a moment, because there's another revolution happening in the background of this story. Something so fundamental to what makes us human that we barely notice it anymore. Something that's literally dripping off your body right now if you're doing anything more strenuous than lying perfectly still in an air-conditioned room. I'm talking about sweat. You are covered, absolutely covered, in somewhere between 2 and 4 million specialized glands whose sole purpose is to produce salty water and squirt it onto your skin surface. That might sound gross or mundane, but it's actually one of the most sophisticated cooling systems ever evolved by any mammal on Earth. And it only works because you're naked. Let me explain why this matters so much. Every mammal faces the same fundamental problem. Bodies generate heat. Muscles working, hearts pumping, brains thinking, digestion processing food. All of this produces thermal energy that has to go somewhere. For most mammals, this isn't a huge deal. They can pant to cool down, seek shade during hot hours, reduce activity when temperatures rise. They have various strategies to manage heat load, and they generally work well enough. But for human ancestors spreading across Africa during and after the climate shifts we discussed earlier, the heat problem was becoming critical, because they weren't just surviving anymore. They were walking, endlessly walking, tracking game animals, searching for water, moving between seasonal food sources, covering distances that would exhaust other primates, and they were doing it under the African sun in the middle of the day, when every other predator had the good sense to rest in whatever shade they could find. This created a metabolic crisis. Walking generates about 4 times as much heat as resting. Walking under direct sunlight adds the entire radiant heat load of the sun, roughly 1,000 watts of energy per square meter. Walking in pursuit of game that can run faster than you means maintaining this activity level for hours, maybe all day. Do that in a fur coat and you die. Not might die, will die. Hypothermia, heat stroke, organ failure. Your brain literally cooks inside your skull before you catch anything worth eating. Evolution had a choice to make. Either humans stay hairy and accept the limitations that come with it, restricted activity periods, shorter pursuit distances, less ambitious hunting strategies, or humans lose the hair and develop something better. They developed something better. The human sweating system is genuinely extraordinary. Other mammals have sweat glands, sure, but they're usually concentrated in specific areas, paw pads, around the nose. They're used for traction or scent marking more than cooling. Humans are different. We have eccrine sweat glands distributed across almost every square inch of our body surface. Your forehead alone has about 200 sweat glands per square centimetre. Your back, your chest, your arms, your legs, all covered in these microscopic thermal management factories working continuously to keep your temperature stable. And here's the really clever part. These glands don't just produce water, they produce a carefully calibrated mixture of water, salt, and other dissolved substances that's been optimized for evaporative cooling efficiency. When this sweat reaches your skin surface and evaporates, it removes heat, a lot of heat. Every gram of water that evaporates from your skin removes about 580 calories of thermal energy. Not food calories, but thermal calories, units of heat that would otherwise be cooking your organs. For this system to work, though, the sweat has to reach your skin surface and evaporate into the surrounding air. And here's where fur becomes a problem. Thick body hair creates a microclimate next to your skin, a layer of trapped air that's warm, humid, and relatively still. Sweat that evaporates in this microclimate doesn't cool you efficiently because the heat energy isn't being carried away. It just sits there, raising the humidity in your fur layer until evaporation slows to a crawl. You end up soaking wet and still overheating. Remove the fur, though, and everything changes. Sweat reaches bare skin. Airflow across that skin carries away the evaporated moisture immediately. The cooling effect is dramatic. Studies show that naked humans can maintain comfortable body temperatures during exercise, in conditions that would quickly incapacitate furred mammals of similar size. This wasn't just convenient, this was transformative. Because suddenly your ancestors could hunt in ways that were impossible for almost any other predator. They developed what anthropologists call persistence hunting, the technique we discussed earlier. Find a herd of antelope, start walking toward them at a steady pace. They run away, but you keep walking. Your eccrine sweat glands are pumping out moisture. Your bare skin is evaporating it efficiently. Your body temperature stays stable hour after hour. The antelope, covered in fur, can sprint but can't cool down while moving. After a few minutes of running, they have to stop and pant, standing in whatever shade they can find, trying to bring their body temperature back down. While they're stopped, you keep walking. Steady, relentless, never needing to pause because your cooling system works continuously. After 6, 8, maybe 12 hours of this, the antelope collapses. Its cooling system has failed. You walk up and claim your meal. This sounds almost like science fiction, but it's not. Modern persistence hunters in the Kalahari Desert still use these techniques. They can run down kudu, one of the fastest antelopes in Africa, in the middle of the day, in temperatures that would kill most predators. They do it because they're naked and they can sweat. Their prey can't compete with that cooling capacity over long durations, no matter how much faster they are in short sprints. But the sweating revolution had consequences beyond hunting. It solved one problem, overheating, while creating new ones. The most immediate issue was water. Efficient sweating requires massive amounts of water. A human engaged in moderate activity in a hot environment can lose 2 to 3 litres of water per hour through sweating. That's catastrophic dehydration unless you're constantly replacing the lost fluid. This meant human ancestors couldn't range far from water sources. They needed to know where every waterhole, stream and seasonal spring was located in their territory. They needed to develop water storage technologies, containers made from ostrich eggs, animal bladders, anything that could carry precious water during long hunts. They needed to cooperate, sharing knowledge about water sources, helping group members who were struggling with heat stress. The humans who survived weren't just the ones with the best sweating systems. They were the ones who were smart enough and social enough to manage the constant hydration challenge that came with those systems. Water management became a critical skill, driving the development of planning, cooperation, and technological innovation. But the sweating revolution didn't just help humans survive in hot environments, it helped them thrive in ways no other mammal could match. That persistence hunting capability worked anywhere prey animals had to stop and pant. Hot savannas, obviously, but also temperate grasslands during summer. Even in cooler climates, a human in pursuit could outlast furred animals during the warm parts of the day. This gave human ancestors access to resources that other predators couldn't efficiently exploit. The big cats hunted in dawn and dusk ambushes, using stealth and explosive speed. Wild dogs hunted in coordinated sprints, using teamwork to bring down prey quickly. But humans could hunt in the middle of the day when every other predator was resting. They could pursue prey to exhaustion over distances that no sprint predator could match. They could, quite literally, run the biggest, fastest animals on Earth into the ground through the simple application of bare skin and sweat glands. And there's another consequence of the sweating revolution that's often overlooked. It helped solve one of the biggest challenges facing human evolution, the brain problem. Your brain is an energy hog. 3 pounds of tissue consuming about 20% of your body's total energy budget. But energy consumption means heat production. Your brain generates about 15 watts of thermal energy continuously, just from thinking, remembering, processing sensory information. Most mammals keep their brain temperatures slightly lower than their core body temperature. They use specialized blood vessel structures in the nasal passages to cool blood before it reaches the brain. It works fine for brains that are using modest amounts of energy. But the human lineage was evolving larger and larger brains. More neurons, more connections, more metabolic activity, more heat. At some point, the standard mammalian brain cooling system wasn't going to be enough. The sweating revolution solved this. With efficient whole-body cooling, humans could maintain stable core temperatures even during intense physical activity. This meant the brain never experienced the dangerous temperature spikes that would occur in furred animals during similar exertion. The brain could grow larger, consume more energy, generate more heat, because the body's cooling system could handle it. Some researchers think this created a positive feedback loop. Better body cooling allowed larger brains. Larger brains enabled more sophisticated hunting techniques and tool use. More sophisticated hunting provided better nutrition. Better nutrition supported even larger brains, and so on, spiraling upward toward the massive brains that characterize modern humans. The evolution of dark skin ties directly into this story. Once you lose your protective fur and start spending hours in direct sunlight, your bare skin becomes vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation damage. This isn't just about sunburn, though that's painful enough. UV radiation destroys folate, a crucial vitamin needed for DNA synthesis and cell division. Low folate levels cause neural tube defects in developing fetuses, leading to miscarriages and birth defects. Natural selection would have acted fast. Within probably just a few thousand generations, human populations remaining in Africa evolved very dark skin. Melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color, absorbs and scatters UV radiation before it can damage cellular DNA. The more melanin you have, the darker your skin, and the better protected you are from solar radiation. This is why all early humans had dark skin, not some of them, all of them. Every human living in Africa during the period when we were losing our fur would have had skin as dark as the darkest modern Africans. This wasn't a racial characteristic or a cultural preference. It was a survival requirement. Lose your fur in equatorial Africa without developing dark skin, and natural selection removes you from the gene pool fast. The package evolved together. Less body hair, more sweat glands, darker skin. Each adaptation reinforcing the others, creating a thermal management system that had never existed before in mammalian evolution. And this system had another unexpected benefit. It helped make possible the dramatic enlargement of the human brain, our most temperature-sensitive organ. But there was a cost. The same adaptation that made humans incredible endurance athletes also made them vulnerable to dehydration in ways no other primate experiences. The same bare skin that allowed efficient sweating also required constant vigilance about sun exposure, hydration, and temperature management. The same system that let humans dominate hot environments became a liability in cold ones, requiring technological solutions like clothing and fire. Yet somehow, humans not only survived these challenges but turned them into advantages. The need for water management drove cooperation and planning. The vulnerability to cold drove technological innovation. The requirement for continuous cooling drove the development of the most sophisticated thermoregulation system in the mammal world. We became the sweating apes. The naked, sweating apes who could run farther than almost any animal on Earth, whose brains could grow to unprecedented sizes, whose bare skin turned vulnerability into strength through the simple chemistry of evaporative cooling. And none of it would have been possible without losing the fur that had protected our ancestors for millions of years. The sweating revolution wasn't just about staying cool, it was about becoming human. But let's step back from all those practical explanations for a moment. Running in the heat, swimming in water, avoiding parasites, these are all about survival, about natural selection weeding out individuals who couldn't hack it in challenging environments. But there's another force at work in human evolution, one that's often overlooked, but potentially just as powerful as any environmental pressure: sexual selection. The simple fact that humans choose their mates, and those choices shape the evolution of our species just as much as any climate disaster or predator threat. Think about it. You're a human living 800,000 years ago, the population bottleneck has just ended, your group is expanding, and for the first time in over 100,000 years you actually have choices about who you reproduce with. There are enough people around that you're not just pairing up with whoever happens to be available. You can be selective. And what are you looking for? What signals tell you that a potential mate is healthy, strong, likely to produce successful offspring? In every other primate species, the answer is fur. A thick, glossy coat indicates good health and proper nutrition. Parasites, disease, stress, they all show up in the quality of an animal's fur. Dull, patchy, poorly maintained fur signals problems. Baboons, chimps, gorillas, they all judge potential mates partly by the condition of their coats. But humans took the opposite path. We made the absence of fur the signal itself. Because here's the thing about naked skin. It's honest. Brutally, unavoidably honest. You can't fake it. You can't hide anything. Every blemish, every scar, every sign of disease or injury, it's all right there on display. Fur is forgiving. It covers imperfections, hides problems, but smooth, exposed skin is a billboard advertising your genetic quality to anyone who looks. Think about what visible skin reveals. Parasites. You can see them immediately, or at least see the marks they leave. No wondering if that potential mate is carrying a load of ticks and lice under their fur. Diseases? Most of them show up on the skin before anywhere else. Rashes, lesions, discoloration, they're all immediately visible. Nutritional status? Healthy skin glows. Malnourished skin looks dull, flaky, aged. Scars tell stories about past injuries and how well they healed. Even age itself becomes impossible to hide. In a species where every individual matters, where losing even one person to disease or injury could threaten the survival of the entire group, being able to assess health status at a glance would be incredibly valuable. And what better way to advertise your own health than to have nothing to hide, to let your skin speak for itself? This is sexual selection in action. If early humans began preferring mates with less body hair because it allowed better assessment of health, then individuals born with genes for reduced hairiness would have reproductive advantages. They'd have more offspring. Those offspring would inherit the reduced hairiness genes. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the preference and the trait would reinforce each other, driving human body hair toward extinction even without any environmental pressure demanding it. But notice what didn't disappear. Head hair, facial hair in males, pubic and underarm hair. These patches remained, even flourished, while body hair vanished. Why? Because they serve different signaling purposes. Head hair is perhaps the most obvious. It remained thick and long enough to become one of the most distinctive features of human appearance. And it makes sense. Head. Hair can be styled, displayed, used as a signal of individual identity and group membership. Every human culture that's ever been studied pays attention to hairstyles. They use them to signal age, status, availability, cultural affiliation, personal identity. Head hair became a canvas for social signaling precisely because the rest of the body was bare. You could modify it, shape it, decorate it in ways that communicated complex information to others in your group. And here's something remarkable. Human head hair is unique among primates. It keeps growing indefinitely. Chimp hair grows to a certain length and stops. Same with gorillas and every other ape. But human hair just keeps going. Some individuals can grow hair down to their waist or beyond if they never cut it. This suggests strong selection for long head hair, probably because it was so useful for signaling. The longer and healthier your hair, the longer you could demonstrate continuous good health and proper nutrition. Facial hair in males tells a similar story. In most human populations, males develop thick beards during puberty. This is a testosterone-dependent trait, meaning it honestly signals male hormonal status. You can't fake it. Either you have enough testosterone to grow a beard, or you don't. Females generally don't develop beards, creating a clear visual distinction between sexes. In a species that walks upright and faces each other constantly, this sexual dimorphism becomes an important social signal. Pubic and underarm hair appeared during puberty, providing a clear signal of sexual maturity. In the small groups where humans lived, being able to tell at a glance who was an adult and who was still a child would have been socially important. These hair patches acted like biological flags saying, I'm ready to reproduce, visible even from a distance. But the retention of hair in specific areas created something else, something that would prove crucial to human social evolution: contrast. Patches of hair against mostly bare skin drew attention to specific body regions: the face, framed by head hair and marked by facial hair in males; the groin, highlighted by pubic hair. These became focal points for social and sexual attention. And this is where hairlessness really changed everything about how humans communicate, because exposed facial skin allowed for something no other mammal could do to the same degree: nuanced facial expressions. Think about trying to read the emotions of a chimp or a dog. You can do it, but it's difficult. Their faces are covered with fur that obscures fine muscle movements, but human faces? We can detect micro-expressions lasting fractions of a second. We can distinguish dozens of different emotional states just by looking at someone's face: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, surprise, contempt, and countless subtle variations and combinations of these basic emotions. We can read intention, detect deception, assess trustworthiness, all from facial expressions. This is only possible because our faces are bare. Every tiny movement of the muscles around the eyes, mouth, and forehead is visible. We evolved one of the most complex systems of facial communication in the animal kingdom, and it required naked skin to work. The same applies to blushing. This uniquely human trait only works because our facial skin is exposed and relatively translucent. When we experience certain emotions, embarrassment, shame, attraction, blood rushes to the face, causing visible reddening. It's an involuntary signal that we can't fake or suppress, an honest advertisement of our emotional state. No other primate blushes, or if they do, you can't see it through their fur, but humans broadcast our internal states on our faces for everyone to see. This created a kind of emotional transparency that would have been incredibly valuable in the small, tight-knit groups where humans lived. You could tell at a glance if someone was lying, uncomfortable, attracted to you, or feeling guilty. This made cooperation easier and deception harder. When everyone's emotional state is visible, maintaining social cohesion becomes simpler. This emotional visibility would have been crucial for the complex social structures that were developing during this period. As groups grew larger, as cooperation became more important, as humans began engaging in activities that required trust and long-term commitment, being able to read each other's emotions became essential, and it all depended on having faces bare enough to reveal those subtle signals. But sexual selection for hairlessness had another consequence, one that would become increasingly important as humans spread across the planet. It exposed our skin to environmental variation in ways that fur-covered animals never experience. And skin, unlike fur, responds quickly to different selective pressures. When humans were confined to Africa, skin color variation was probably limited. Dark skin, rich in melanin, protected against the intense UV radiation at equatorial latitudes. Everyone had dark skin because light skin in that environment meant skin cancer, destroyed folate, and dead babies. But as populations moved into Europe and Asia after the bottleneck, they encountered very different sunlight conditions, less intense UV, particularly in northern latitudes where winters are long and dark. And here's the problem: dark skin in these environments became a disadvantage. Because skin doesn't just need protection from UV radiation, it needs to synthesize vitamin D, and that requires UV exposure. Too much melanin in low UV environments meant vitamin D deficiency, which causes rickets, weakened bones, and reduced reproductive success. So natural selection lightened skin in northern populations, not all at once, but gradually over thousands of generations. By the time modern humans reached Europe around 40,000 years ago, some populations had probably already begun evolving lighter skin tones, and the process accelerated as they moved further north into regions where sunlight was scarce for much of the year. This created the remarkable diversity of human skin colors we see today, from the darkest brown in equatorial populations to the palest cream in northern Europeans and Northeast Asians. All of it became possible because we lost our fur and exposed our skin to direct selection. Fur-covered animals don't show this kind of pigmentation diversity because the fur protects the skin from UV regardless of latitude. But here's what's fascinating. Even as skin color diversified, preferences for certain skin qualities remained universal. every human culture ever studied values smooth, clear, even-toned skin. Regardless of whether that skin is dark or light, the preference for unblemished skin appears to be a human universal. This suggests the original selective pressure that drove hairlessness, the value of being able to assess health through visible skin, remained important even as populations adapted to different environments. Different cultures developed different preferences for other aspects of appearance. Body proportions, facial features, even the amount of retained body hair considered attractive varied enormously. Some cultures prized hairlessness and developed elaborate hair removal practices. Others valued body hair as a sign of masculinity and strength, but the underlying ability to see skin, to read health and emotion on its surface, that remained universal. And this brings us back to the original question. Why did humans lose their fur? Sexual selection provides part of the answer. Because in a species where every individual matters, where cooperation is essential, where long-term pair bonding affects reproductive success, being able to assess potential mates accurately becomes crucial, and the most honest signal you can give is your skin, exposed, vulnerable, impossible to fake. We made ourselves naked because it made us visible, and in the desperate world after the bottleneck, when every breeding decision mattered, when every individual was precious, that visibility was worth the cost. Human hairlessness became a feature, not a bug, a signal, not a vulnerability. And in choosing mates with less fur generation after generation, we created ourselves, naked, expressive, our emotions and health written on our skin for anyone to read. We became the communicating ape, the social ape, the ape that could look at another individual and know instantly what they were feeling and whether they were healthy enough to bet your genetic future on. That's the power of sexual selection. That's how mate choice shapes evolution, just as surely as any environmental pressure. We didn't just lose our fur to survive. We lost it to communicate, to signal, to advertise ourselves, in a world where being seen meant being chosen, and being chosen meant everything. Now let's get into the details. Because losing fur isn't like losing weight or getting a tan. You can't just decide one day that you don't want hair anymore and have it fall off. Hair is encoded in your DNA, written into the instruction manual that builds your body from a single fertilized cell. To go from a furry ape to a mostly naked human required specific genetic changes, mutations that had to happen, spread through populations, and eventually become fixed in the entire species. And scientists have actually identified some of these mutations. They found the exact genetic changes that made us naked. Let's start with the basics. Hair growth is controlled by a complex network of genes, but a few key players do most of the heavy lifting. One of the most important is a gene simply called HR, which stands for hairless. This gene controls the transition between different phases of hair growth, the growing phase, the resting phase, the shedding phase. When HR is working normally, it keeps hair follicles cycling through these phases, producing the thick terminal hairs that cover most mammals. But in humans, something changed. Comparative genomic studies, where scientists line up the DNA of different species and look for differences, have found several mutations in the human version of HR. These mutations don't eliminate the gene entirely. That would be lethal, causing severe developmental problems. Instead, they modify how the gene functions, reducing its activity in most parts of the body. The result is hair follicles that produce vellus hairs instead of terminal hairs. The thin, fine, almost invisible hairs that cover most of your body. It's an evolutionary compromise between being completely bald and being fully furred. The follicles are still there. You have about the same number as a chimpanzee. They're just producing tiny hairs instead of thick ones. But HR isn't working alone. Another crucial gene is FGF5, fibroblast growth factor 5. This gene determines how long hair can grow before the follicle enters its resting phase. In mice with broken FGF5 genes, hair just keeps growing and growing, creating weird long-haired mutants that look like tiny Afghan hounds. In humans, FGF5 works normally in certain areas like your scalp, which is why head hair can grow several feet long if you never cut it. But in other areas, the gene has been modified or its expression has been reduced, limiting hair length to barely visible fuzz. Then there's EDA, a gene that controls the density and thickness of hair follicles. Different versions of this gene create different hair textures across human populations. East Asians, for instance, tend to have a specific variant of Adair that produces thicker individual hairs but fewer total follicles. This variant arose fairly recently in evolutionary terms, probably within the last 30,000 years, showing that human hairlessness is still evolving, still being refined by natural selection. What's fascinating is that when scientists use molecular clock analysis, looking at how many mutations have accumulated and calculating backward to estimate when changes occurred, they get a timeline that matches perfectly with the other evidence for human hair loss. The key mutations in HR appear to have become widespread around 1.2 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000 years, which, in evolutionary terms, is pretty precise timing. This is right around the time the fossil record suggests our ancestors were losing their fur. Right around the time the climate was forcing populations into situations where hairlessness would be advantageous. Right around the time that dark skin pigmentation was evolving to protect newly exposed skin. Everything lines up. The genetic changes, the environmental pressures, the anatomical adaptations, they all point to the same period, roughly 1 to 2 million years ago, as the crucial time when humans went from furry to naked. But losing hair created an immediate problem, a deadly serious problem. Without fur, human skin was suddenly exposed to something it had never dealt with before. Direct sunlight. Intense, unfiltered ultraviolet radiation that could cause sunburn, skin cancer, and destroy folate, a crucial vitamin needed for DNA synthesis and fetal development. The solution came through another set of genetic changes, mutations in genes that control skin pigmentation. The key gene here is MC1R, melanocortin-1 receptor. This gene determines how much melanin, dark protective pigment, your skin cells produce. In our furry ancestors, MC1R didn't need to be particularly active. The fur provided protection from UV radiation, so skin color didn't matter much. You could have pale skin under dark fur and survive just fine. But once the fur was gone, pale skin in equatorial Africa became a death sentence. Severe sunburn, yes, but more importantly, UV radiation breaks down folate in the bloodstream. Low folate levels cause neural tube defects in developing fetuses, leading to miscarriages and birth defects. Any individual with a pale skin mutation would have dramatically lower reproductive success. Their babies would be less likely to survive. Natural selection would have acted fast, brutally fast. Within probably just a few thousand generations, maybe 10,000 years, maybe less, the human populations remaining in Africa had evolved very dark skin. Not gradually, not slowly, but in an evolutionary sprint driven by the immediate life or death pressure of UV exposure. The MC1R gene in African populations shows evidence of strong positive selection, meaning individuals with dark skin variants were significantly more likely to survive and reproduce than those without. But here's where the story gets complicated, because modern human populations show tremendous variation in skin color, from the darkest possible shades in parts of Africa and Melanesia to the palest complexions in Northern Europe. This variation tells us something important. The evolution of hairlessness and the evolution of skin color happened in stages, not all at once. When our ancestors first lost their fur in Africa, they evolved dark skin as protection. But as human populations later migrated out of Africa into Europe and Asia, they encountered environments with much less intense sunlight. Suddenly, dark skin became a disadvantage, because you need some UV radiation to hit your skin to produce vitamin D. Without enough vitamin D, you get rickets, bone deformities, problems with calcium metabolism that reduce your chances of survival and reproduction. In the low light conditions of Northern Europe and Northern Asia, especially during long winters, dark skin blocked too much UV radiation. People couldn't produce enough vitamin D, leading to serious health problems. So populations that migrated north evolved lighter skin, mutations that reduce melanin production, allowing more UV to penetrate and trigger vitamin D synthesis. The MC1R gene shows different mutations in European populations compared to African ones, mutations that reduce melanin production rather than increase it. Interestingly, East Asian populations evolved light skin through different genetic changes, mutations in different genes entirely. This is convergent evolution, multiple populations independently solving the same problem through different genetic routes. It suggests that the selection pressure for appropriate skin color in different environments was incredibly strong enough to drive rapid evolution in multiple populations simultaneously, each finding its own genetic solution to the UV vitamin D balance. The molecular clock data suggests these skin colour adaptations happened fairly recently. The variants associated with pale skin in Europeans probably emerged within the last 30,000 to 50,000 years. Some researchers think it might have happened even more recently, possibly as late as 10,000 years ago, accelerated by the adoption of agriculture. Agricultural diets provided less vitamin D than hunting and gathering lifestyles, increasing the advantage of light skin that could synthesize more vitamin D from limited sun exposure. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The key point is that losing hair required a cascade of genetic changes. First, mutations that reduced hair growth, changes in HR, FGF5, and related genes. Then mutations that adjusted skin pigmentation to match local UV radiation levels, changes in MC1R and other pigmentation genes. And the genetic changes didn't stop there. Remember how humans retain terminal hair in certain areas? Your scalp, armpits, groin, and for men, facial hair and chest hair. Why? What makes these areas special? The answer lies in gene expression patterns. The genes for hair growth are present everywhere in your body. Every skin cell has the complete instruction manual. But different genes get turned on and off in different locations, controlled by regulatory sequences that act like molecular switches. In areas where humans retain thick hair, those regulatory switches kept the hair growth genes fully active. On your scalp, this probably relates to thermoregulation, protecting your brain from overheating and preventing heat loss in cold conditions. In your armpits and groin, the retained hair serves a different function. These areas contain specialized sweat glands, apocrine glands, that produce thicker, odor-causing secretions involved in scent signaling. The hair in these regions helps disperse those scents, broadcasting chemical signals about your age, sex, and reproductive status. The genetic changes that made humans mostly hairless apparently left these regions alone, possibly because the social signaling functions were important enough that natural selection preserved them. Facial hair in men is particularly interesting because it's controlled by sex hormones, specifically testosterone. The genes are the same in men and women, but testosterone activates additional regulatory switches during puberty in males, causing thicker, darker hair growth on the face, chest, and other areas. This suggests that facial hair evolved as a sexually selected trait, possibly as a signal of male maturity and dominance. The genetic basis for this involves androgen receptor genes that respond to testosterone by activating hair growth programs in specific regions. It's an elegant system, the same genes, expressed differently depending on sex hormones and location, creating the distinctive patterns of human body hair distribution. Modern human populations show significant variation in body hair, and that variation is genetically determined. Some populations are relatively hairy, others quite smooth. Mediterranean populations, for instance, tend to have more body hair than East Asian populations. This reflects different selection pressures and different evolutionary histories. In colder climates where humans wore more clothing, there might have been reduced selection pressure for complete hairlessness, allowing some populations to retain more body hair. In hotter climates, the advantages of efficient sweating might have driven more complete hair loss. Different populations represent different points along a continuum of hairlessness, each adapted to their specific environmental and cultural context. What's remarkable is how fast all these changes happened. From the first mutations in hair growth genes around 1.2 million years ago to the diversification of skin color and body hair patterns in different populations over the last 100,000 years, human hairlessness evolved in what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink. This tells us that the selection pressures must have been enormous. Individuals with the right mutations for their environment had significantly better survival and reproductive success than those without. Natural selection was operating at maximum intensity, rapidly reshaping the human body to meet new challenges, and we can see this rapid evolution in our genomes today. When geneticists look at the patterns of variation in hair and skin pigmentation genes, they find signatures of recent selection. Long stretches of DNA with very little variation, indicating that particular gene variants swept through populations so fast that neighbouring DNA sequences got carried along unchanged. This is the genetic fingerprint of evolution in action, proof that human hairlessness wasn't some gradual drift but an active response to intense environmental pressures. The story written in our DNA is clear. Our ancestors lost their fur through specific identifiable genetic changes. Those changes created new vulnerabilities that required additional adaptations, and the entire process was shaped by natural selection operating across hundreds of thousands of years and millions of individual lives. Every human alive today carries these mutations, these evolutionary scars from our species' long journey from furry ape to naked ape. We are quite literally the descendants of the ones who survived being naked when being naked was dangerous. The ones whose mutations happened to match their environment. The ones whose genes for dark skin protected them in Africa, or whose genes for light skin allowed them to thrive in northern latitudes. We carry their genes because they were the ones who made it, the ones who reproduced successfully despite all the challenges that hairlessness created. But genetic changes alone don't tell the whole story, because losing our fur had consequences that went far beyond just genetics. It changed how we lived, where we could live, and what we needed to do to survive. Those consequences and the adaptations they forced upon us, that's what we need to explore next. Here's what most people don't realize about losing our fur. It wasn't just a cosmetic change. It fundamentally transformed what it meant to be human, because once your ancestors shed that protective coat of hair, they became vulnerable in ways no other primate had ever experienced. And vulnerability, it turns out, is one hell of a catalyst for innovation. Think about it. A chimpanzee can sleep under a tree when it rains and wake up uncomfortable but alive. Try that as a naked human in a temperate climate, and you're looking at hypothermia by morning. A gorilla can trek through thorny undergrowth without a second thought, their thick fur protecting them. You, with your exposed skin, would be torn to ribbons within minutes. Other primates can handle temperature swings of 30 or 40 degrees without much difficulty. You need shelter, fire, and clothing just to survive a typical spring day in most of Europe or Asia. So here's the question. If being naked made us so vulnerable, how did we become the most successful large mammal on the planet? How did these hairless, fragile creatures not just survive, but dominate every terrestrial ecosystem from the Arctic to the Sahara? The answer is that our nakedness forced us to become inventors, not just tool users. Lots of animals use tools, but systematic, creative, problem-solving inventors who could adapt to any environment through technology and culture, rather than waiting millions of years for biological evolution to do the work. Let's start with clothing, because that's the first and most obvious consequence of hairlessness. Lose your fur coat, and you need a replacement. The archaeological evidence for early clothing is frustratingly sparse, because organic materials like leather and plant fibers don't preserve well. Animal skins rot, bark cloth disintegrates, woven plant materials turn to dust. But we can date the invention of clothing through a surprising source: lice. Remember those 3 types of lice that parasitize humans: head lice, pubic lice, and body lice. Genetic analysis of body lice shows they diverge from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That's when body lice evolved as a distinct species, adapting to live in clothing rather than body hair. And they could only do that once humans started wearing clothes regularly enough for the lice to specialize in that ecological niche. So by around 100,000 years ago, your ancestors were wearing clothes. Not occasionally for special occasions, but regularly enough that parasites could evolve to exploit this new habitat. This represents a cognitive revolution. Making clothing isn't like picking up a stick to probe for termites. You have to imagine the finished product before you start. You have to understand abstract concepts like cutting, joining, fitting. You need to develop entirely new technologies, scraping hides to remove flesh and soften them, processing plant fibers, creating needles and thread, inventing ways to tie or stitch materials together. More importantly, you have to teach these skills to your children. Clothing manufacture became one of the first truly complex technologies that required generational knowledge transfer. A young chimpanzee can learn to use a termite stick by watching mum a few times. Learning to make a fitted garment from animal hides requires years of instruction and practice, watching experts, making mistakes, gradually mastering dozens of individual techniques. This created selection pressure for teaching ability and learning capacity. Individuals who were better at acquiring and transmitting complex skills had survival advantages. Their children were more likely to survive cold nights, more likely to thrive in challenging environments. Over thousands of generations, this refined human cognitive abilities in ways that set us apart from every other species. But clothing was just the beginning. Because here's the thing about being a naked ape in a world that regularly drops below freezing. Clothing helps, but it's not enough. You need fire, not just for cooking, though that's useful. Not just for protection from predators, though that matters. You need fire to literally stay alive through the night in most of the world's temperate and cold zones. Early humans had been using fire opportunistically for maybe 1 million years. Lightning strikes, natural wildfires, these could be exploited for warmth and cooking when they occurred. But hairlessness created pressure to control fire systematically, to make it on demand, maintain it through wet conditions, transport it from place to place, teach others how to manage it safely. Archaeological sites from around 400,000 years ago show evidence of systematic fire use. Hearths that were maintained over long periods, careful placement of fires inside caves and rock shelters, strategic use of different woods for different purposes. This represents another technological leap. Fire management requires planning, knowledge of materials, understanding of combustion and airflow. It's chemistry and engineering without the formal concepts. More than that, fire created new social dynamics. A fire needs tending. Someone has to gather fuel, maintain the flames, make sure it doesn't spread dangerously. This creates opportunities for labour specialisation. While some group members hunt or gather, others maintain the fire. While some sleep, others keep watch and feed the flames. Fire also changed when and where humans could socialise. Before controlled fire, your ancestors would have been like other primates, active during daylight, resting at night in trees or protected locations. Fire extended the day. It created a focal point for evening gatherings. Anthropologists think this is when storytelling evolved, when elder knowledge began to be systematically transmitted through narratives told around the fire. The technology we needed because we lost our fur became the centerpiece of human cultural evolution. And then there's shelter. Third animals can sleep rough most nights without serious consequences. Naked humans cannot. We need protection from elements that other primates shrug off. This forced our ancestors to become builders, architects, engineers. Early shelters were probably simple, caves and rock overhangs that nature provided. Natural protection that required minimal modification. But caves aren't everywhere, and they're often occupied by other large predators who aren't interested in sharing. So humans learned to build. The earliest constructed shelters date back at least 400,000 years. Circles of stones that probably anchored wooden frames covered with hides or vegetation. These aren't impressive by modern standards, but they represent something revolutionary. The ability to create artificial environments, to modify your surroundings rather than just adapting to them. This skill set would eventually let humans colonize literally every land environment on Earth. The Arctic, where winter temperatures drop to -40 and darkness lasts for months. Tropical rainforests where constant moisture and biting insects make life miserable for any large mammal. Deserts where daytime heat can kill in hours and nights get cold enough to freeze. No other large mammal lives in all these environments. Polar bears stay in the Arctic. Jaguars stick to the tropics. Camels avoid the poles. But humans, fragile, hairless, vulnerable humans, we're everywhere. Not because we biologically adapted to each environment, which would take millions of years, but because we culturally adapted. We invented parkas and igloos for the Arctic, breathable clothing and raised dwellings for the tropics, desert robes and water storage for arid regions. Our nakedness, which should have been a fatal weakness, became our greatest strength because it forced us to develop the cognitive and cultural tools to adapt to anything. But the consequences went beyond just technology. Hairlessness changed our social dynamics in profound ways. Because when you're naked, you're visible. Every scar tells a story. Every injury is apparent. Physical condition, age, health status. These become immediately obvious in ways they aren't for furred animals. This created new opportunities for social signalling that we discussed earlier, but it also created new vulnerabilities and new forms of social organisation. Body decoration emerged as a way to communicate identity and status. Ochre and other pigments show up in archaeological sites from at least 100,000 years ago, used not for camouflage or practical purposes, but for adornment. Humans were painting themselves, creating visual markers of group membership, individual identity, social status. The same impulse continues today in wildly diverse ways. Tattoos, scarification, body painting, cosmetics. Every culture has developed elaborate practices around modifying the appearance of naked skin. The same is true for hair maintenance. Modern humans engage in incredibly complex behaviours around the hair we've retained. Some cultures remove it almost entirely. Others cultivate specific styles. Some see hairlessness as attractive. Others view it as childish or weak. There's no universal standard because the meanings we assign to body hair are entirely cultural, not biological. What's fascinating is that humans are the only species that deliberately modifies its hair for social and aesthetic reasons. No other animal spends time styling, cutting, dyeing, or removing its fur. This behaviour only makes sense in a species that's already mostly hairless, where the remaining hair has become a canvas for cultural expression rather than serving primarily functional purposes. But we're not done evolving. Evolutionary biologists who study human morphology have some interesting predictions about where we're heading. Because here's the thing about body hair, we're still losing it. Modern humans have less body hair than humans did 10,000 years ago, and that trend seems likely to continue. Why? Because we've created artificial environments, climate-controlled buildings, protective clothing, central heating and air conditioning. Natural selection for body hair has essentially stopped in modern technological societies. There's no survival advantage to having more body hair when you live in a house and wear clothes. There's also no significant disadvantage to having less. So what happens is genetic drift. Random mutations that reduce body hair don't get selected out because they don't affect survival or reproduction. Over thousands of generations, these mutations accumulate. Some models suggest that in another 100,000 years, humans might have even less body hair than we do now, perhaps retaining only eyebrows, eyelashes, and scalp hair. The patches that still serve clear protective functions. But here's what's truly remarkable. None of this matters for human survival anymore. Whether we have more body hair or less, whether we keep our remaining hair or lose it entirely, it won't affect our ability to thrive on this planet. Because we long ago transcended the biological constraints that limit other species. We lost our fur and had to invent clothing. That made us inventors. We needed fire and had to control it. That made us engineers. We required shelter and had to build it. That made us architects. Every vulnerability that came from our nakedness forced us to develop new capabilities, new technologies, new social systems, new ways of understanding and manipulating the world around us. And that's the real consequence of hairlessness. It didn't just change what we looked like, it changed what we were capable of becoming. It transformed us from just another African ape into something unprecedented. A species that could adapt to any environment not through evolution, but through innovation. A species that could colonize an entire planet, not by developing specialized biology for each habitat, but by developing the cognitive tools to create specialized solutions for each challenge. We are naked because our ancestors needed to run down prey under the African sun, or because they spent time in water, or because they needed to avoid parasites, or because sexual selection favored it. Probably all of these reasons played some role. But we are human, truly human, because being naked forced us to become something more than our biology, something that could survive through creativity rather than adaptation, through culture rather than evolution, through innovation rather than instinct. That's the legacy of hairlessness, not just the strange appearance it gives us, but the extraordinary capabilities it forced us to develop, the technologies, the social structures, the cognitive abilities that make us unlike any other creature that has ever lived on this planet. We lost our fur, and in losing it, we gained the world. So here's where we end up after following the trail of our missing fur across millions of years of evolutionary history, with a simple but profound realization. There was no single moment when humans lost their hair, no dramatic mutation, no sudden evolutionary leap, just layer upon layer of evolutionary pressures, each one pushing our ancestors toward increasingly bare skin over hundreds of thousands of years. The Savannah Hypothesis, running under the brutal African sun, needing to dump heat faster than any other mammal. The Aquatic Ape Theory, maybe spending enough time in water that fur became a liability rather than an asset. The Parasite Problem, every louse, every tick, every disease-carrying insect providing natural selection, with another reason to favour hairless individuals. Sexual selection, smooth skin becoming a signal of health, youth, attractiveness. Social signalling, the ability to blush, to show emotion through our exposed faces, creating deeper bonds and more sophisticated communication. None of these explanations alone is sufficient, but together they paint a picture of evolutionary forces converging on the same solution. Hair had to go, and when it did, everything changed. Because here's the thing about losing our fur, it wasn't just a cosmetic change. It was a cascade that shaped nearly everything that makes us human. Without hair, we needed clothing. The development of clothing required planning, tool-making, abstract reasoning. It pushed our ancestors to think ahead, to prepare for future needs, to imagine the finished product before beginning. Without fur's protection, we needed shelter. Not just temporary sleeping spots, but constructed spaces that required cooperation and innovation to build. The ability to create artificial environments, to modify our surroundings rather than just adapting to them. Without hair to provide insulation, we needed fire. Mastering fire meant mastering one of nature's most dangerous forces. It meant developing the cognitive capacity to maintain and control something that could easily kill you. The thermoregulation problem forced us to become the planet's best endurance athletes. That shaped our entire body plan, long legs, narrow hips, specialized foot architecture. The need to cool our overheating brains during persistence hunts drove selection for more efficient neural structures. Bigger brains, yes, but also better organized, more energy efficient. And the social aspects of hairlessness, the ability to read emotions on bare faces, to signal through blushing and complexion changes, that laid groundwork for the sophisticated social systems that would eventually let us build civilizations. We are naked apes. And that nakedness connects to language, tool use, art, culture, everything that separates us from our closest primate relatives. All of it traces back, at least in part, to those first ancestors who started losing their fur under the African sun millions of years ago. The ones who discovered that bare skin could be an advantage if you were smart enough and social enough to work around its vulnerabilities. Your ancestors were those individuals, the ones who survived, despite being naked and vulnerable, who turned a potential weakness into humanity's greatest strength, who learned to dominate every environment on Earth despite having none of the natural armor, fur, claws or fangs that other apex predators relied on. They did it with intelligence, cooperation, and the evolutionary adaptations that came from being furless primates trying to survive in a dangerous world. Every time you sweat through a workout, you're using the cooling system that hair loss made possible. Every time you bundle up against the cold, you're compensating for the insulation your ancestors lost. Every time you read emotion on someone's face, you're using the communication advantages that bare skin provided. We are the descendants of the naked apes, and that nakedness made us human. But let's be honest about what we don't know, because despite decades of research, despite genetic analyses and fossil studies and comparative anatomy, we still can't say with absolute certainty why humans lost their fur. We have good theories, we have compelling evidence, we have logical explanations that connect multiple lines of data. But we don't have definitive proof of exactly when, why, or how the transformation occurred. The fossil record is too fragmentary. Hair doesn't fossilize, so we can't directly observe the transition. We're inferring hairlessness from indirect evidence, skeletal adaptations for running, genetic markers for skin pigmentation, archaeological signs of fire and clothing use. Each piece of evidence is suggestive, but none is conclusive. Different researchers emphasize different factors. Some think thermoregulation was primary. Others believe parasites were the driving force. Still others argue for sexual selection or aquatic adaptations. The truth is probably that multiple factors work together. Evolution rarely has single causes. It's messier than that, more complicated. Environmental pressures, genetic drift, sexual selection, cultural practices, all of these can influence the direction of evolution simultaneously. And the relative importance of each factor probably changed over time as circumstances shifted and populations adapted. What we do know with reasonable confidence is the rough timeline. Hair loss probably began sometime between 2 and 1.5 million years ago, coinciding with the emergence of Homo erectus and the adaptation to more open, hot environments. The process was gradual, taking hundreds of thousands of years to reach the mostly hairless state we see in modern humans. Dark skin pigmentation evolved around 1.2 million years ago to protect newly exposed skin. Different body regions probably lost hair at different rates, and for different reasons. We know that by around 100,000 years ago, humans were regularly wearing clothing, which tells us body hair was already mostly gone. We know that head hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, and patches of hair in scent-producing regions were retained for specific functional reasons. We know that later populations evolved lighter skin as they migrated into northern latitudes with lower UV radiation. But the exact sequence of events, the precise causes, the relative importance of different selective pressures, these remain subjects of ongoing research and debate, and that's okay. That's how science works. We don't have all the answers, and we might never have complete answers to some questions. But that uncertainty doesn't diminish the profound impact that hair loss had on human evolution. Whether the primary driver was thermoregulation, or parasites, or sexual selection, or some combination of all three, the result was the same. We became naked apes who had to compensate for that nakedness through innovation and cooperation. Maybe that's the real answer to why we lost our fur, not because of any single environmental pressure, but because the combination of challenges we faced made hairlessness advantageous enough to overcome its costs. And once we started down that path, once we began developing technologies and social structures to compensate for our nakedness, it became impossible to go back. We had committed to a strategy of cultural adaptation over biological adaptation, of solving problems with our minds rather than waiting for our bodies to evolve solutions. This strategy has served us extraordinarily well. We've colonized every terrestrial environment on Earth. We've survived ice ages and droughts and volcanic winters. We've gone from small bands of hunter-gatherers to a global civilization of 8 billion people. We've split the atom, mapped the human genome, sent robots to other planets, and none of it would have been possible if we'd stayed furry. The vulnerability created by hairlessness drove us to develop capabilities that no furred animal could match. So as you drift off to sleep, as your breathing slows and your thoughts become less focused, as the world around you fades into the background, think about this. You are the product of millions of years of evolution shaped by forces you'll never fully understand. Your smooth skin, your ability to sweat, your capacity for complex communication, these aren't random features. They're the result of countless generations of ancestors who faced impossible challenges and somehow survived. You carry their genes, their adaptations, their innovations. Every time you look in a mirror and see bare skin, you're looking at a testament to their resilience, to their ability to turn vulnerability into strength, weakness into opportunity, liability into advantage. The naked ape staring back at you conquered the world not despite being naked, but because of it. Because being vulnerable forced creativity. Because lacking natural defenses demanded intelligence. Because having nothing to rely on except each other built the social bonds that make civilization possible. And maybe that's the most important lesson from the story of human hairlessness. That our greatest strengths often emerge from our apparent weaknesses. That the challenges we face shape us in ways we can't predict. That evolution isn't about becoming perfect, but about becoming good enough to survive in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. We lost our fur millions of years ago. We can't get it back, and we wouldn't want to. Because in losing it, we became something unprecedented. Something that could adapt to any environment, overcome any obstacle, achieve things no other species has ever dreamed of. We became human, naked, vulnerable, brilliant, creative, unstoppable humans. And it all started with a simple change that seemed like a liability at the time, but turned out to be the key to everything we would become. So sleep well, knowing that you're part of this incredible story, that your bare skin connects you to millions of years of evolutionary history, that you're the descendant of survivors who face challenges we can barely imagine, and somehow made it through. Tomorrow you'll wake up and go about your day, probably not thinking about why you're naked while other primates are furry. But now you know about the savannas and the water and the parasites, about the sweating and the signalling and the social bonds, about the innovations and adaptations and the long journey from furry ape to naked human. You know the story of how we lost our fur, and in losing it, gained the world. Rest easy, naked ape. Your ancestors would be proud.